Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm just going to give a few minutes before I actually start with this live discussion into the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Giving you guys a live update for the month of June and giving you an update on that outlook for this year's hurricane season. While we wait for other people to hop on and join in this live update, just a few announcements and some housework around the soaring weather. For everyone that's been following, there are new videos that are up on the Soaring Weather YouTube channel. The first is the first hurricane season discussion that I did back in May, and that was the initial outlook of the start of the season. If you have not already seen that, there's a lot of helpful information, even though this outlook is going to be the most current one and probably was going to be likely to occur. So if you don't watch the outlook, definitely watch the other information that I talk about in that video, because it's very, very informative on just hurricane forecasting and weather forecasting in general. Another video that was uploaded a week ago is the Colors of Lightning. It's going to be the first of a series called Quick Questions, where I answer weather-related questions in 2 to 3 minutes and informative and entertaining style. So the first of that series, the Colors of Lightning, why do we see Colors of Lightning, is up on that same YouTube channel as well. So if you have not seen it, make sure you go and subscribe to Soaring Weather. Go check out those videos, and again, subscribe for even more videos that are going to be coming out in the coming months. And if you have a quick question idea that you'd like to submit, make sure you sound off in the comments or even just message me as well, and that could even become the next quick question video that we do on Soaring Weather. With that said, we're going to start right into the June update for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. And boy, it has been quite the active season so far. We've already had 3 storms so far this year for the start of the season. We've already had 2 tropical cyclones before even the start of the season. And these 2 pictures to the left and in the center are Tropical Storm Arthur and Tropical Storm Bertha forming in the month of May, which is quite unusual to see 2 tropical storms form before the official start of the hurricane season. And then we just had a third one, Tropical Storm Cristobal, that made landfall not only in the Bay of Campeche, but also along the Gulf Coast as well, and even retaining some of its organization over land. And we'll talk about that just in a little bit. So we've already had 2 before the official start and another third just recently. So it's been quite the start to the season so far. I did not include this in my last live update, but I wanted to include it just so that we can see the tropical storm names that we have for this year. So we've already gone through A, B, and C, which is Arthur, Bertha, and Cristobal. And we also have a bunch of other names that are given to tropical storms that develop enough organization to be given that name. So we go pretty much through most of the alphabet, skipping a few letters here and there down the list. And another little tidbit of information, if we need to, there's another naming scheme past the list of names that are given for the tropical season, and that goes into the Greek alphabet. Only one time it has been really gone into the Greek alphabet, and that was from the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. That was quite the active season with 28 storms overall. So hopefully we won't need to get into Greek names for this season, but we'll talk about it a little more as this live update goes further. Again, we've had a historical and unusual start to the season. This is the 6th year in a row with a named storm before the start of the season. And we had 2 May storms this year for May. Tropical Storm Arthur and Bertha, as I said before. And this is the first time since 2016 that there were 2 or more named storms developing for the start of the season. And the first time since 2012 that those 2 or more storms were formed in the month of May, which ties the record for the most named storms in May with 2012 and 1887. So we're breaking some historical ground here for this 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. We also had Tropical Storm Cristobal as well. It's a very historical and unusual lifespan, formed from the remnants of an East Pacific Tropical Storm Amanda, which crossed over into the Atlantic Ocean just before the start of the hurricane season and eventually became Atlantic Tropical Storm Cristobal. And became the record earliest 3rd named storm with the letter C, and that was previously held by Tropical Storm Colin back in 2016. So again, more historical records being broken for this year. And it was the farthest westward track ever seen since 1881. I'll just show that in just a second, just to show how far Crystal Ball went out. And a weird thing with all three of these cyclones is that all three of them impacted the U.S. and had some sort of U.S. impact. So it was very unusual to see that at the start of the season, let alone in the month of June, before we even get to the peak of the hurricane season. Now, I said Crystal Ball had a very unusual track. It tracked farther west than usual, and you can see that right with this graphic. The line in black is Crystal Ball's track as it went over Lake Michigan and passed into Ontario. And so far, this is the only tropical cyclone that has tracked this far west and north since 1850, when we started keeping track of tropical cyclone tracks. So this is a very unusual track for a tropical cyclone to make, just because of the setup that prevents it from coming out such west and north. Usually you have west to east winds keeping the tropical cyclone and pushing it out east, but this is a very unusual track just because how north and west it went. Now that we've talked about what has gone on, it's important to talk about what we're going to be looking at for this hurricane season, what is updated since that first live update that I did. Again, here's some other forecasting things that I've used and using for looking at this hurricane season. Look at the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a big factor into tropical storm hurricane development in the Atlantic. We're also looking at trade winds, which are also affected by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. We're also going to be looking at sea surface temperatures, because that's where tropical cyclones mainly get their energy from, and that's how they develop within the Atlantic and just in the ocean overall. Another thing I want to add that I did not mention from the last update is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And I'll talk about that more in just a little bit and what that is. And there's also other climate patterns that we're going to be looking at for this hurricane season. So looking at first thing is the change in the El Nino probabilistic forecast from early April, when I did my first update, to early May. Now, the probability of ENSO neutral for the majority of the season remains. However, the chance of a La Nina coming in towards the end of the season has increased, and you can see that in the highlighted blue box that we have for the majority of the season. And even past that, as you see on the bottom chart for December, January, and February, that chance of La Nina begins to increase after that. So that La Nina probability has increased from the last time we talked about the ENSO and El Nino probabilities. Now, the new El Nino ensemble forecast, I talked about ensemble forecasting in the first update, but basically what it is a computer model that has ensemble members within that forecasting model, and there are slight variations of the main model that is being used for the ensemble forecast. And these little differences reflect errors in the forecaster, changes in the atmosphere at any given time, since it's such a chaotic system, and other sorts of variations within the atmosphere and the forecast. So for this ensemble forecast, majority of the ensemble members trend toward either an ENSO neutral or a weak La Nina coming in towards the end of the season, probably right after the peak of the hurricane season in September. So that's something to watch out for, since La Nina is very favorable for Atlantic hurricane cyclones to develop for the season. Some ensemble members are even trending towards a stronger La Nina towards the end of the season. So this is something to take into consideration when forecasting for the season overall and giving an outlook for this hurricane season. Another tool that I want to throw in to talk about for this outlook that I did not mention in the last one is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, or the AMO. The AMO is a climate cycle like the ENSO or other climate cycles that you hear meteorologists, even climatologists, talk about that affects sea surface temperatures of the North Atlantic Ocean, and it's based on different phases or modes on a multi-decadal timescale, hence the name multi-decadal oscillation. Now, the NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, references the AMO in their outlook for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, and they even say that the AMO will come into play towards the end of the season or during the majority of the season, because we're going to be going into a warming phase of the AMO during the season. And I have circled on this picture to the right where we're at right now with the AMO and where we're going to be heading soon. So you see that big red peak on the graph, and that's where we're at right now, and it's likely to stay there for the majority of the season. So this comes into play with sea surface temperatures, so it just backs up the fact that we're going to be having above average sea surface temperatures for this year. One thing I wanted to talk about, just because of how similar it is to the 2005 hurricane season, is just I want to compare what we're seeing now with the current atmospheric conditions and even sea conditions, and compare it to historical information, which is kind of the analog forecast. It takes similar conditions that we've seen in the past and makes that same judgment to forecast the weather for the future. So one thing I wanted to mention was the conditions we're seeing right now are similar to the ones seen from 2005, from that Atlantic hurricane season, for a multitude of reasons. First one is the AMO is in a warming phase, not as strong as this 2005 one, but is definitely going into a warming phase, and that's something that's similar from the 2005 season. Sea surface temperatures are warmer than average, although not as warm currently as 2005. Those were record breaking sea surface temperatures for that year. But keep in mind, we're still above average for what we usually see in the Atlantic. And also, a weak El Nino began in the calendar year, and then eventually became an ENSO neutral for the majority of the hurricane season. And then a La Nina phase came in, a very weak one, came in towards the end of the season, and that was able to ramp up hurricane development way past the peak and going even into January as well. They had used some of the Greek alphabet names that I had mentioned before. 28 storms in total were formed for that season, so it was a very active season overall, a record-breaking one at that. So I just wanted to mention the 2005 season and compare that to what we're seeing right now, just to give a gauge of what to expect for this year. And this picture that I have right below is the El Nino Oceanic Index. Is basically a score that is given to the El Nino regions that we watch that could affect climate, weather overall, and even tropical storm development in the Atlantic and even the Pacific as well. So the first circle I have is from the 2005 going to 2006 calendar year, and you can see we had that weak El Nino towards the beginning of the calendar year, and then eventually became a weak La Nina towards the end of the year. And as we look to the far right, the second circle, right now we're in a weak El Nino that's currently weakening down to an ENSO neutral, and just adding to the fact that we could see La Nina come into the end of the season is a little bit worrisome. And I'm not trying to fearmonger or anything, but it's something to watch out for, since the 2005 season had similar conditions as well. And just to go off of that even more, we also have the AMO index here. You can see for the year 2005, we have a little bit of a peak, a weak warming phase for the AMO. And as we look at 2020, we're just warming up into a warm phase right now with the AMO. And NOAA mentioned that in their outlook for this year's hurricane season. So these are just all things to consider when we're forecasting for this year. Now, moving on to other tools, sea surface temperatures have not changed that much. The AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, just supports the fact that we're going to be going into a warmer phase of the AMO, and that's going to lead to above average sea surface temperatures. Not much has changed for the areas of interest that we're going to be watching for hurricane development, so not much has changed from that first update that I talked about. Another thing good to look at is the published outlook, seeing what other forecasters are saying for this year. From the last forecast, not much has changed overall from the other forecasters, mainly because there haven't been any updates. Usually these updates come later on in July or August before the peak of the hurricane season. But one forecasting agency that did update their forecast or their outlook for the season is Colorado State University. And as of June 4th, they are now predicting 19 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. So that's an uptick of what we saw from the first outlook that we had talked about. And then towards the right, we also added the NOAA's outlook for this hurricane season. And they also said an above-average season is expected for this year. 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes being Category 3 and up on the Saffir-Simpson scale. If you don't know what that is, it is a rating scale for hurricanes based on sustained winds. So the strongest you can go is Category 5, which I'm not sure what the exact amount is off the top of my head. But it's basically a rating scale based on the sustained winds from the storm. That's probably going to be another QQ or just even an information video that I'll talk about in the future, the Saffir-Simpson scale. But going back to the published outlooks, it seems that we are reflecting and these conditions that we had just talked about, and we're looking at even more active hurricane season, just based on NOAA's outlook and Colorado State University's updated outlook. These all support a above average hurricane season for this year, which leads into my outlook for this year. And this is as of today, June 12th, not June 6th. And there's a multitude of reasons why I have these figures the way they do. And that's due to the above average sea surface temperatures that we had just mentioned, the neutral ENSO phase that we had talked about possibly becoming a La Nina towards the end of the season, which will ramp up hurricane development even past the peak of the season, maybe even past the end of the season as well. There are also factors like normal trade winds are expected for this year, and it's expected to be a very active season overall. And taking all these factors into consideration, it just supports that it's going to be a very active season, more active than usual, and produce more cyclones than normal for this year. So my figures are going to be 20 to 22 named storms for this year. I'm not going to put 28 because I had mentioned 2005 we had seen 28 named storms from that. I'm not going to put that figure only because we are not seeing those record-breaking sea surface temperatures that we did in 2005. So it's not likely we're to pass that number at all. Maybe even get close to it, but not pass it at all. So that said, named storms 20 to 22, an uptick from my last figure, a little more honed in as well for the numbers. Let me go back there. 10 to 12 hurricanes overall, and 5 to 6 major hurricanes or Category 3 or higher. So that's my outlook for June going forward. We're going to have to see more as the hurricane season goes on, how this plays out overall. Because once we get into July, we'll get a clear picture of what the rest of the season is going to look like. So once we see that first system in June, late June, early July, going forward, we'll get a better picture of what we're expecting for the rest of the hurricane season and the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season overall. So that's my June update overall. Above average activity, definitely something to watch out for. If you have not seen my first initial update outlook, I highly recommend you go check that out. There's a lot of helpful information on not only hurricane forecasting and forecasting for the season, but there's also emergency preparedness information there as well. Tips and tricks to get ready for this hurricane season, since it is going to be an active one for this year. And again, if you have not seen my quick question on the colors of lightning. Highly recommend you watch that and share it with all your friends, family. Very informative, very entertaining. It's a good watch and a very quick one at that. That being said, this concludes the June live update for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Hope you guys stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.